coming to the session, sorry, Siddharth, for a long intro there. Coming to the session, I'm going to limit my role here by reading out something completely different from what the session is meant to be. It's up to each of you to make that connection, if at all, and to your own wisdom. I felt this was very important, both from a political history point of view, as well as understanding when a community goes through an agonizing period of transition. As I said, from fighting each other because of one being traditional, small scale, artisanal community, and the other being a mechanized sector, to the National Fisheries Action Council. And later, over years, today we have brought back that battle inside NFF, saying that the small scale fish workers and artisanal community needs to be recognized and be the priority of the organization as well. I don't know if you guys know this guy. Pretty much all of you know this guy. Trust me, so you guys know this guy better than me. I'm actually going to read out. So this is Trevor Noah's Siddharth. For you and Savi, I'm just saying this loud. I just showed the cover of the book. Trevor Noah's autobiographical first half called Born a Crime. A highly recommended book from my side. Take it. It's definitely fun reading it. You won't put the book down till you finish it. But also very, very informative in the political history of South Africa, which is a region that all of us must make an effort to understand, because of the simple fact that South Africa has witnessed something that the rest of the world thinks they know, but we don't know about, which is apartheid. We think that the difference between blacks and whites is apartheid. Apartheid was never that. Apartheid was the most organized, institutionalized, constitutionalized structure of disparity, inequality, and discrimination. Extremely high forms of injustice being institutionalized was apartheid. So I'm just going to read this one section, which I found very, very interesting in the context of our discussion. Sid, forgive me this time. After that, the time is all yours. When Dutch colonists landed at the southern tip of Africa over 300 years ago, they encountered an indigenous people known as the Khoisan. Khoisan, Khoisan. The Khoisan are the Native Americans of South Africa, Trevor says. A lost tribe of Bushmen, nomadic hunter-gatherers, distinct from the darker Bantu-speaking peoples, who later migrated south to become the Zulu, Xhosa, and the Soto tribes of the modern South Africa. People have heard about Zulu, Xhosa, Sonta, and all of those. While settling in Cape Town and the surrounding frontier, the white colonists had their way with the Khoisan women, and the first mixed people of South Africa were born. To work the colonists' farms, slaves were soon imported from different corners of the Dutch Empire, from West Africa, Madagascar, and the East Africa, East Indies as well. The slaves and the Khoisan intermarried. So the slaves and the Khoisan intermarried, and the white colonists continued to dip in and take their liberties, and over time, the Khoisan all but disappeared from South Africa. While most were killed off through disease, war, famine, the rest of their bloodline was bred out of existence, mixed in with the descendants of whites and slaves to form an entirely new race of people, the colored or the colored. The colored people are a hybrid, a complete mix. Some are light and some are dark. Some have Asian features, some have white features, some have black features. It is not uncommon for a colored man and a colored woman to have a child that looks nothing like either parent. The curse that colored people carry is having no clearly defined heritage to go back to. The curse that the colored people carry, and remember, this man comes in the category of a colored man with a white father and a South African mother, a Xhosa mother. The curse that colored people carry is having no clearly defined heritage to go back to. If they trace their lineage back far enough, at a certain point it splits into white and native and a tangled web of the other. Since their native mothers are gone, their strongest affinity has always been with their white fathers or the Afrikaners. Afrikaners are written with a K. I hope you guys are familiar with the term. Most colored people don't speak African languages. They speak Afrikaans. Their religion, their institutions, all of the things that shaped their culture came from Afrikaans. The history of colored people in South Africa is, in this respect, worse than the history of black people of South Africa. For all that black people have suffered, they know who they are. Colored people don't. So, welcome back to the session and over to Siddharth. But just to quickly introduce the frame in which we thought we will deal with the session. To understand the fisheries, especially from an Indian subcontinental point of view, which is largely surrounding the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Bay of Bengal, there are two clear prisms that emerge. One is a state way of looking at the fisheries resource, right? One part of that is also how we look at seafood, right? We don't look at fish. I mean, I look at fish as seafood mostly. Like, that's a reality of our existence. The state point of view of looking at fisheries sector is the first part that we will deal with, which is the technical state point of view. The second part of it is actually the community point of view or the people's point of view of how they look at fish, fishers, fish management, fisheries resource. So Siddharth has been a comrade for a few years. We have been friends, comrades in arms. Siddharth has been part of the research collective of PSA for last couple of years and more. Has been a researcher. Previous to that, he was a Merchant Navy sailor and was in the sea for close to a decade or more, and developed his own interest in working with different conflict areas in the sea where seafarers and fisher people were involved, and started working literally as a humanitarian aid, including fighting legal battles for people who were, I mean, especially the fishing community people across different continents. And that comes with that richness of his engagement, mostly self-picked up as a matter of his own job at one point of view, and then later his interest. So hence, when he came to the research collective of PSA, we were very, very happy to have someone with that kind of an experience and interest area. Siddharth has been part of, along with Ishita first and then later Savita, developing the 2 volumes of occupation of the coast. I'm sure you must have seen the 2 volumes of those. And 2017, when they were working on the occupation of the coast, blue economy was not even a framework that the World Forum of Fisher People was looking at, unfortunately. They were still looking at ocean grabbing as the concept. And since the WFP General Assembly was held in Delhi, we got an opportunity to insert some of these points of view and the World Bank's constant harping about the blue economy framework. So Siddharth has been a researcher, as I said, a movement comrade, and someone who has been very, very intrinsically trying to look at some of the narrative questions. So I think Siddharth is one of the right people to bring in this question of state point of view and people's point of view. Siddharth, over to you, man.
So I think I would like to start by saying that I come to this presentation not as a historian, not as a biologist, and not as someone who represents the community either. I come as someone who has spent a large part of my adult life working at sea, and being a Brahmin man, I'm very intrigued by how the upper caste bureaucracy of India understands and decides upon fisheries policies, a fluid kind of wild space that is far removed from their offices on land. And thus, a large part of this presentation is going to be centered on using that lens as a way to read Indian fisheries. And I think this is important for two reasons. One, I think it gestures towards our thinking as researchers, students, reporters, and the larger public about how we consume data about fisheries and how this shapes our imagination about the fishing sector. And I think, two, it opens up a door to actually listen to alternative readings of fishing communities and fisheries, which have been pushed to the margins because of the way we engage with fisheries. Um, in the Excel sheet, it's clear that there are members of the fishing community in the audience today. And I hope that this presentation can poke some holes in the state's reading of the fisheries so that all of us over the next 5 days can listen to some of these alternate stories. I would also like to have any of you intervene at any point if there needs to be a slowing down, a repetition, if I'm passing on incorrect information as well, particularly from people who are from the fishing community. This morning, I read words from an artist, Hindu Hari Kumar, who was attending a workshop and said that her intention was not to compare herself with others and to try and connect with people without feeling envious of them. So I think that's the intention that at least I come in to this as well, to be able to learn together. So Vijayan has already explained the structure. And finally, on the last point about Vijayan, I just wanted to say that I might not need the mandate of what the description was entirely. I've come into this session a little accidentally. The parts that are missing are not within my area of expertise, so we can try and figure them out together. And I also have an intense expression that seems to give the impression that I'm uninterested or disappointed. I just wanted to say that this is far from the matter at hand. And the expression is usually just a way to cope with the anxiety of speaking in public. I am usually a lot jollier than I look. So I wrote that down because that has been a feedback very often. So I'm just going to share my screen and start off. Okay, so we've spoken a lot. Just to run through a few slides about Indian fisheries. Again, just think of it as a bureaucrat in Delhi who's a joint director and is just speaking about fisheries, because we'll find this information out there all the time. So the way we understand Indian fisheries today has to start with what is India's jurisdiction. And the lines that we see on this map along India's coastline is the exclusive economic zone. These were kind of negotiated in the 70s and 80s and became the waters that Indian state has jurisdiction over. So essentially, all the fisheries resources in these waters, it's an area which is about 2 million square miles, doesn't matter, belongs to India. And India, under obligations of like the Convention of the Law of the Sea, has to exploit these waters optimally, conserve resources, and therefore is essentially the body that controls them. India also has the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the Lakshadweep Islands, which the Lakshadweep EEZ is connected to the mainland EEZ on the west coast. And then the Andaman and Nicobar has a bit of common high seas waters. And then it's connected it's closer to the Thai and the Indonesian EEZs. So that together forms the Indian EEZ. In terms of the federal structure under which Indian fisheries are kind of regulated in India, within the EEZ, you have the exclusive economic zone, which is from 12 nautical miles from land, that's about 25 kilometers, up to about 200 nautical miles, which is 340 kilometers. So that band of water is under central jurisdiction. And then from the land, so if you'll go to Vasco Fishing Harbor on your field visit and you look out to sea, about 25 kilometers belongs to the state of Goa. And so the territorial waters come under the regional state's jurisdiction in the sense that they have control over fisheries policies, regulation, closures, fishing gear, monitoring, science, annual reports. And the moment you shift outside of the territorial waters into the EEZ, it goes under the central jurisdiction in terms of sovereignty and control. The state and the center obviously are continuously co-managing these resources in the sense that they go, because most fishing, as we'll see, straddles both the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zone. So the state and center have coordination in the way fisheries are managed. Um, Now, to give a short kind of visual representation of Indian fisheries, if you were to look at in terms of the color coding on at the bottom of each of these maps, blue is essentially no effort, and then red is maximum effort. And so, moving from 1950 to 1980 to 2014, fishing effort has been increasing in the Indian EZ. So from the 60s onwards, there was the advent of mechanization that started moving out beyond territorial waters into the EZ. And now, other than a few parts of the deeper waters of the EZ, which are still orange in the 2014 map, you see there is red, which is that there is a lot of effort in fishing that is happening in the Indian waters. And that looks somewhat like this map. So this is from 2019. And we'll come back to this again later. But essentially what this is showing is what I was trying to say in a couple of slides before, is that fishing effort of different kinds leaves from regional states and makes its way into the EZ, where it meets fishing vessels from other regional states and exploits resources that get landed back. So, for example, because we are in Goa, if you were to look at, let me try and annotate actually. Can you see the mouse at all, where I'm pointing to?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that's the state of Goa. And these blue dots that we see are fishing vessels registered to Goa. Similarly, that's the state of Kerala, and all the pink vessels that we see are fishing vessels registered to Kerala. And so essentially, while the Goan EZ would end 12 nautical miles out here, a lot of the fishing vessels are venturing further out into the EZ, catching fish on multiple day trips. They can be 7 days long, 14 days long, 21 days long. And then they come back to Goa and land the fish. And essentially that fish which is captured in the EZ gets landed to Goa. Goa has revenue generation that happens out from it. And similarly, other states do the same as well. So that's how a lot of the expansion and fishing in the Indian EZ looks like today. Talking about fisheries resources, again, this is just the simplified view. We'll try and kind of come back to these in the second round. But essentially, the way the Indian fisheries look at fisheries, the classification is mollusks, so which is clams and mussels. Then you have crustaceans, which is prawns. And then you have the demersal and pelagic resources. Demersal are lower or bottom dwelling fishes. There's a lot of biologists, so I think it'll be interesting to have a discussion if you all do about this later as well. And then you have pelagic resources. In terms of the top left one, essentially what that is doing is dividing up these resources depending between the territorial waters and the EZ on what is available for commercial exploitation. And then the bottom kind of right is doing a depth-wise distribution of the fish, the same fish that is available. And so you can see that, in the 0 to 100 meters depth, you've got about 86% of the fish that is available. Then from 100 to 200, it drops off. And similarly, as you go away from shore, the amount of percentage of total fish that is available keeps dropping. And there's reasons for that. Again, India's got multiple rivers that flow into it. There's multiple species that developed closer to shore. There's a lot of the Indian ecology that plays a role in this. Continental shelves are generally a lot more productive than deeper waters. And so, as this next map shows, the ocean is not a flat space. The east coast and the west coast of India differs a lot in the way the continental shelf is shaped. So, for example, again, just to annotate really quick, that's Mumbai and it's on the coast, but it's just, if you look at the continental shelf kind of dropping off in that direction, you've got a much wider kind of depth of water that is not very deep, and then it drops off. Similarly, from Gujarat, that's kind of mainland Gujarat over there, and you can see up to the Pakistan coast, there's a lot of the continental shelf that is available. On the other hand, if you come to the East Coast and look at Chennai, which is again a coastal city, that direction of the continental shelf is a lot lesser. Similarly, a lot of the Lakshadweep, doesn't have a continental shelf. It's essentially just a group of coral atolls, so like dropping off right away. And this, of course, influences fisheries in different spaces. It influences fish distribution in itself, but it also plays a role in how fish are caught, what species are caught, what gears are used, whether some regional states are better endowed to catch certain fish. And what that does is that it creates, so the annotation doesn't go off, sorry. And so when you don't take that depth view and you just look at what kind of the landings are, and you'll find this data a lot in like government documents and a lot of reporting documents. As we've spoken, you've got the mollusk, the crustacean, the demersal, and the pelagic resources. This is an all India kind of distribution. Pelagic resources form the biggest amount of landing, crustacean, mollusk, not so much. The way the government divides this catch up is into three categories. So mechanized boats, motorized boats, and non-motorized boats. Indian fishing today is overwhelmingly in the mechanized category. So that, as you can see, it's like 81% of India's landing come from mechanized boats, which are relatively the bigger boats. We'll talk about that in the second round as well. Then you've got the motorized ones and non-motorized, which are with sails or with little paddles, people, venturing out without any forms of propulsion. It's down to really a small percentage in terms of the way government counts data. And then, of course, you've got each state, which shows how much fish they've caught. I'm going to talk about Gujarat and Goa later. So, Gujarat has a massive amount of landing. It's 7.5 lakh tons. And Goa is really tiny. It's just got like 1/3 of a lakh tons. So again, those continental shelves, the length of the coastline, etc., creates a lot of diversity. And that's roughly how, landings look like. And they're divided into these categories. Each state, of course, has their own variation, which there isn't time to go into, but that's something that plays a factor as well. Now, the phases of expansion that have happened have come sort of in three phases. So until 1950s, early 1960s, you really had a lot of the fisheries, which was coastal, it was community-based, it was not very heavily motorized, and a lot of it was kind of local consumption, in the sense that the way the forests were exploited under colonization and the amount of timber extraction that happened for, let's say, the railways or for exports or clearing forest lands for like rice cultivation, paddy cultivation, the coasts in that way, other than a few trading hubs, did not have the same kind of extractive impact. And so until the 50s and 60s, you had fisheries, which was fairly low scale. And then in Kerala in the 1960s, you started with the Indo-Norwegian project. That was the first kind of development project that came in with foreign aid. Post kind of independence, we were also in this development era of national development. So a lot of the infusion of capital and technology transfers came for national development. From 1960 to about 1980s, you can say it was the era of mechanization, largely on the West Coast. Middle of 1980s, 1990s.
Sid, can you just hold for a second? There?
Yeah, sure.
There is a question here.
Sorry, so that this is Ria. My question was, what's the difference between mechanized and motorized? Like, what exactly do those two terms mean?
So very simply put, motorized boats will use engines which are either external engines, so you can have outboard motors, or they'll have smaller 2-cylinder, 3-cylinder, like 20 horsepower, 30 horsepower internal engines. But they won't have, but the fishing gear in itself will be deployed by hand. So there'll be a group of people who work on the motorized boats and use fishing gear that is either hand-drawn, set in, the gear, so the lifting and raising of the nets happens physically. Mechanical boats essentially have motors of a larger capacity. You can have 100 horsepower, 200 horsepower. Now there's even engines, apparently in West Bengal, some of them are 600 horsepower engines.
600 horsepower.
And so you have the gear on the ship in itself has machinery attached to it as well. So for example, a trawling boat has winches, which will use the winch to kind of pull in fishing gear, because the scale is so large that, humanly you can't just pull in that fishing gear. Or pursine boats or gillnet boats will have, which we'll come to as well, will have like a hauling tackle that is running on a hydraulic motor or an electric motor. And so that kind of increases the capacity of that boat to catch fish. And that essentially goes into the mechanical category of boats, and non-motorized which have neither. So it's physically propelled and physically fished.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's come back to the presentation. Yeah. Yeah. Sid, please.
I mean, we went through the first two stages. The third stages was essentially where a lot of the boats which had been left out, so the artisanal, small-scale, traditional boats, which had been affected adversely by mechanization, strong resistance during those years of the 70s and 80s. 80s is also the era where you're coming into liberalization. Indian capitalists are looking to expand outwards. There's pressure from outside capital to invest in Indian fisheries. And so all of that culminates in the Indian state's kind of 5-year plans responding to the motorization of boats in itself. And so that period from the 80s onwards sees a continuing trend of mechanization, sees also motorization of a lot of non-motorized crafts happening. So if you see between again, just to annotate, like if you see kind of this phase here, and then you see this phase here between like the non-motorized and motorized, the mechanized boats haven't changed so much, but the share of non-motorized boat kind of drops off and the number of motorized boats come up. And since about 2010, 12, then onwards, what you have is that there is a gear diversification happening. So for example, in mechanized boats, you're seeing increasingly a shift that is happening from, let's say, trawl boats to pursine boats. And then today, in terms of like real policy, you've got even trawl boats being phased out and an expansion into kind of long line fisheries or squid jigging fisheries into deeper waters. So there's diversification of those gears that is happening. And similarly, motorized boats as well. There's gear diversification that is happening. One of your field visit sites is Baina Bay, which is next to Marmagua Port Trust. And a lot of that bay operates something known as ring scenes. So it's small motorized boats with outboard motors, but they've kind of changed their fishing gears to be able to mimic some of the larger gears, but at a smaller scale. And that's kind of the diversification that is happening. There's a lot of, in the way, I mean, I think it'll be interesting if Jones can later contribute to this, but, the role of technology, it is said that if the 60s and 70s and 80s were this kind of imposition of technology from above, then the 80s, 90s, and kind of the changes that have been happening in motorized boat design, gear design, catching since, are also a response of technology from below, which is not often spoken about. And I think, because Jones is from Tutur, and, you have a whole artisanal deep sea fishing fleet that operates out of there in the high seas and runs a very kind of advanced operation, but again, doesn't make its way into the mainstream. There's a lot that has been happening between this imposition of technology from above and how people have been taking to and responding with technology in themselves as well. Just to quickly run through this, again, I'll be sharing all of these. I can also share the links to these documents if you'd want to. But this is just to show, the next two slides are just to show that, each of the states has its own kind of census, and there's a lot of diversity in them. So for example, when we saw that the national government kind of says that 83% of the catch is caught by mechanized boats, if you look at a state like Goa, you'll see that, motorized mechanical boats, which is essentially mechanized boats, there's 2,500 of them, but then there's barely any motorized boats. Like the census says there's one. And if you go and look at Gujarat, for example, and the reason I keep saying Gujarat and Goa is because Gujarat has India's longest coastline. It's about 1,600 kilometers long. And then you've got Goa, which is one of the shortest coastline. It's about 103 kilometers long. And so in them, they give an interesting contrast on the west coast about how fisheries are different. And then if you look at Gujarat fisheries, there's a significant number of motorized boats and mechanized boats as well. And so those catch combinations are very regionally specific in what is happening in each state. And so And at the bottom, of course, are the total number of vessels. So you've got about 269,000 boats that operate out of India as of 2019. They're not all registered. So if you go to any coast, you'll find that a lot of boats are not registered. This is particularly because I do work in West Bengal, and the West Bengal government has stopped registering boats which are motorized and mechanized. And so we haven't seen many people with their boats registered. So the likely number of vessels is much higher. And then, of course, you've got the other numbers as well. But that's a significant number of vessels which operate from the Indian coast. And similarly, then you have the marine fishers in themselves. So you've got, including Andaman and Nicobar, you've got 8,118 kilometers of coastline. You've got 3,477 fishing villages. And then you've got that data. We don't have to go into that, but there's a few significant things. Of course, one is the below poverty line categories, and that in itself is also a state way of like classifying fishers. But the prevalence of below poverty line in fishers is much higher than the rest of the country. It's like about 60% of the fishers in coastal communities are classified as below poverty line. And similarly, there's 3.7 million fishers in coastal communities, but a lot of them are no longer practicing fishing, or the way they practice fishing is no longer counted in census. We'll come to that in the second round as well. And so, I mean, just along the same lines, before we end this round, is of course that you have small scale fisheries, which shows a diversity of gears. And then you've got fish that is landed with different kind of gears. So you've got trawlers, you've got purse seiners, you've got gill nets, you've got drift nets, and then you've got a whole combination of smaller gears that really don't make it into the mainstream. But I just wanted to check with Vijayan if we need a description of what these different fishing gears are, or whether people in the room are clear enough about, you know, what they mean and what these terms imply.
I don't think people are very clear. Yeah. So the fishing gears issue, Ashwati was just saying that Tanmay's presentation did cover some of it in the morning, but
Okay.
I think it will also be good because I don't think these are things that are easy to register. It will be good to hear it from different people to kind of absorb it further, because this is exactly like on the whole question of identity of who are we looking at. This is exactly the conflict and the contradictions and the dilemmas that we are talking about. So I think it's important for, if you could just take a, yeah, Meghna wanted to ask you something. 1 second, I'll just.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Sid. You know what? Usually, when we look at these gears in person, it's so difficult to understand what net they are or what gear they are, and they usually combine two different gears together, and that's what I've seen. And so, how do you usually go about when you're in the field to get an idea of what exactly are they using? Because it's so difficult to go out and see. Also, when they show it or stretch it out and show, it looks same. Like be the trawl nets, yes, we can know, but something like purse seines and shore seines, and also gill nets when they are. There's a very different form of a gill net that they have been using, especially in Andhra Pradesh.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you differentiate them?
So again, I mean, I would probably deflect this conversation to people who are from the fishing community to have a chat about some of those gears, because there is, and I had a slide which is in the next presentation, is just to say that so much is undocumented. There has also been so much adaptation and ingenuity that has gone into different fishing gears. But, you know, Savita and I, when we were in Goa, we used to do visits to fishing harbors. And at least for mechanized boats, one of the good ways to understand fishing gears is to look at what fishing boat they are coming out from, because it's not possible unless you have like some of the Kerala blue boats, which are built purposefully for like 2 or 3 different kind of fishing gears. It's not possible for a trawl boat to deploy or haul in like a purse seine gear unless they are designed in such a way. And so each of those boats have like specific designs, and that's at least how I look at it. Between again, like as you said, between trawl and purse seines, there's a very clear difference, because trawls have this triangular kind of shape and purse seines are just long. You'll probably be able to make out from kind of the depth of the net, and also the floats that are used. It's a much heavier kind of flotation system. With the gill nets, it's a much finer net. It's also targeting like not shoaling species. It's mainly for the gills. So you'll find that the float arrangements on the top and then the marker buoys and all look different as they do to purse seines. Long lines, of course, are entirely different as well. And then, of course, the ring seines, which are a smaller version of the purse seine, would probably be much smaller in size because they're hand-hauled and they go on to like ring seine boats. So I think placing them next to the craft that is there, and of course, then speaking to the people who are deploying them, is probably like the best way to figure out what fishing gear is being used. But usually that's what I would do. And if anybody else would like to give a response, please feel free to.
But we also have multi-gears on a single vessel, right? So that's something that's a place where we also.
Siddharth, Jones is trying to attempt to.
Yeah. Of course.
So what are the gears which has been shown? These gears are sponsored by the state, whether it is trawl net or Percy net. It is not a traditional way. It is a uniform way of fishing. Usually fishing is not a uniform way of fishing. The entire scenario where the policies and gears, everything fit is that to unify fishing. Say example, when I go to a class, I know that all students are wearing in the same uniform. So only the fishing harbor concept and other concepts are emerged, like trawling, unique boats in fishing harbor. Easy for a researcher to take data, but it is not in reality. So that reality doesn't work. Same thing for Percy nets. It is an old Percy net is totally different, traditional way of Percy net. When this government introduced this ring seine and this Percy, which is adapted from the Western technologies for more harvest, it is totally different. But what happens when it comes to the scene of fishers? Only the boat which they have given to the fisher, like take trawl boat. When they given the trawl boat to the fishers in 1970s, it is only for the shrimp farms, only to bottom shrimps, which is their target, which is their export target. But fisher developed it. Today's trawlers, the fisher developed trawlers. According to Toothukudi coast, because Toothukudi coast is a rocky shore, it is not a uniform sea from east coast and west. Depends upon that, he will put his imagination and his indigeneity, he will change the gear. So if you study whatever in the books of this is gill net, and if you see in the reality, it won't be there. Very improvised. Then this climate change after 90s, after the climate change, this after tsunami, which I have seen is that after tsunami, each boat there will be more than 60 nets, which means the climate change impact is not alone with this carbon and whatever sea level rise. It is on the ocean current and the wind current. So basic depends upon the ocean and the wind current. He will have his own gear, and he will decide only in the sea, not in the shore. So nowadays in the small scale fishing itself, they have a store of nets. So what to apply, because they will say kacha and koda katna. It is northeast and north. While going to fish, it will be kacha morning. In the sea, it is changing. So you have to take the other net. So immediately they will tune the nets according to that. So studying in the books, seeing the nets or the uniform way which they have been given is totally different from the practical way of fishing. Take example of Odisha also. Odisha Chilka fisher is totally different in those days. Now the gears are entirely given by the state, Percy nets. And they traditional nets will be have mixed with the Percy nets, today given nets. So it is not a multi-gear. It is the way of the sea and the way of the ecology which acts. Gear and nets change accordingly to the seas. It is not a uniform sea from east coast and the west coast. There is no uniform species. That's why the entire CMFRA data we can counter very easily. CMFRA data where the data, they go to harbors. Usually they say, that's what this overfishing. Whenever say there is overfishing. Why overfishing? Because these are all shore-based researchers. They are not mid-sea researchers. So they take the data saying that today there is no sardine. Baba, whether they have taken sardine nets today? No. If they have taken sardine nets in the beach landing, they will not do beach landing. They only will go to fishing harbor. because trawling is a uniform net. This species, this species, this species. Beach landing is a traditional motorized craft, which will in the beach landing. Beach landing, every village there will be beach landing. So they will not go to the beach landing to get data because there are so many beach landing data, and they will use multi gears. Depends. So if you go to if a CMFRA scientist go to a beach landing, say Thuthukudi, comes to a beach landing today morning, he will take the data in the shore that today sardine is not there, but today he will went for mackerel. Depends upon this wind current and the ocean current, he would have taken the net. So this overfishing concept is an imaginary myth they are trying to create. It is not alone the fishers are looting. It is not, see, morning the two ecological classes which we learned is that fish comes to the shore to lay eggs. Today the shore is occupied by ports. Shore is occupied by industries. Shore is, then how does the fish comes to the cold water? Then how does the net? So depends upon this, the entire way of life is changing. So that phenomena we have to understand. CMFRA scientists, their education is only based upon tank fishing. Mollies, ornamental fishing, they only know that. Basically, their studies is that. We study sociology, we know sociology. We study economics, we know economics. They study only fisheries breeding in the tanks. So entire data will have this thing. That's what Jason was asking, that there is no deep sea fishing vessel in Tamil Nadu. It is zero data. Zero data. Because they didn't register any boat under deep sea vessel. And the other assumption, we should I'm taking your time, Sid. Other assumption is that, as he said, Niti said, morning said, straightway, all the CMFRA scientists, straight 12 nautical miles deep sea. It will not never come. 12 nautical miles deep sea. Fisher will not go straight line. He will do fishing this way. He will do fishing this way. So the entire concept of their understanding of deep sea, they say that deep sea fishing. Thuthukudi is still 16 nautical miles, it is rocky sea. After that only continental shelf will come. Where does your act lie? So depends upon the rocky sea, depends upon the ecology, their way of life, fishing gear, everything is changed. It is like unifying the fish. Take unifying the water now. Everywhere you can drink distillery water, it is enough, adaptive. Everywhere you can eat shrimp. Like that, fishing cannot be unified. Now they are trying to make a unified fishing.
You said that fishermen are not overfishing. They are given targets by the government. So how is the government enforcing those targets? Is it like if you don't bring in that much catch? No, but what if you don't meet the target? Then what happens?
You don't meet the target, what happens is that won't be target in the sense is that government is fixing a target for export revenue. It is more about economy. I need 1,000 rupees. Yeah, for that my scheme will give you net. Your net is so weakened, it is so indigenous. Your fish will not give me 1,000 rupees. So that is the target. So their target is to loot more and more resources. This is not conservation.
Participate in that. To participate in the target. That's what I'm asking.
I will say an example. In those days, so say example. Nice. Say example. In those days, there were cotton nets before 1950s. Cotton nets, only cotton nets. Cotton nets are mended by fisherwomen. So fisherwomen had a work in the home. Okay. What will cotton net will do? If you go and put fishing for cotton net, you can't catch more than 4 kilos. What will cotton net? It will tear it up. 1950s, when the Norwegian government came, they do so many researches in FAO and other things, and they introduced nylon net. Nylon net is for more and more catch. That time, they said, 1915 document, it is very clear, underexploited resources. These are all underexploited resources. So you are given nylon net. Say example, fisher refused to Kanyakumari, they said that no nylon nets because my women is going out. Your net is coming from company and it is coming from Japan and China. I will not get this off. I will do only this. Okay, there is no scheme for you. Let it be. No scheme. So what happens gradually? They were fighting against this industry. Nylon net mending industry which has come in their town. Industry closed. Industry closed. Norwegian project went out. After 3 years, the same village went to the government and said that we need the company back. Because other villages are adopted nylon nets. Because you will give nylon nets for 100 rupees nylon nets, you will give for 80 rupees in subsidy. Same green revolution, this is blue revolution. But nobody talks about blue revolution. But what happened? Women has been taken out. Same thing if you go to Nagapattinam. People refused nylon nets in 1960s. 1970 there was a cyclone. Nothing was there with them. Cyclone, net relief, nylon net came. No option. Today also same formula. Today same strategy. Today after 18 cyclone, Gaja cyclone, their mechanized boat has been drawn off. They were against deep sea fishing. Only I will give deep sea fishing. If you want to take deep sea boat, you take deep sea boat. Otherwise, I don't have any boat. So what? This is a forcible way of trapping you. You don't have an option. Option is decided by the global market, and it is accepted by the state government. It is accepted by the coastal state. See this principle when you are saying about territorial waters. See, large conventions are there. Morning we were talking. Biodiversity convention, this convention, we should adapt that. One of that convention we adopted is UNCLOS, United Law of Seas Convention, which is territorial waters is 12 nautical miles. 12 to 200 is EEZ, exclusive economic zone. That's what should also say. There's a Lukna in India, 12 nautical miles is given to the state, other 198 nautical will go to the central. You have adopted the principle. You got my point. State will have the control of 188 kilometers. EEZ. State will have only 12 nautical miles. Within the 12 nautical miles only, the state registered boat should operate. Whether it is mechanized, whether it is motorized, or whether it is catamaran. How it is possible? You have adopted that law. But how it is in practical? It is a political scenario. My sovereignty of law. So these are the hidden things in the policies which are not seen through the eyes. As we said now, when they show the gear, their indigeneity will be lost. You will see only from the book item. This is not gillnet. Actually, this is not gillnet. Gillnet is adapted to chilka. It is also a way of gillnet. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Siddharth, there is one more. It's a response, right? आप हिंदी में बात करना है तो बात. There is Rizwan from Gujarat. So Rizwan wants to say something.
हाय, मेरा नाम रिजवान है और मैं गुजरात से हूँ। तो मैंने जो पीपीटी में देखा तो CMFRI का जो डेटा है बोट्स का, तो वो 26,000 के करीब है। बट गुजरात में ऐसी बहुत सारी बोट्स है जिनका कुछ अता पता ही नहीं है। एज पर द गुजरात फिशरीज एक्ट, आपको बोट कैंसिलेशन के लिए लाइसेंस, आपको एप्लीकेशन देना पड़ता है। उसके बाद फिशरीज डिपार्टमेंट वो कैंसिल करेगा। ठीक है, ऐसी बहुत सारी बोट्स है गुजरात में जिनका इंजन कहाँ पे है और जिसका लकड़ा किधर है। ठीक है, उसका कुछ पता ही नहीं है। तो ये डेटा, ये जो स्टेटिस्टिक्स है, वो उसको भी हमको क्रॉस चेक करना जरूरी है कि कितने फिशरमैन है जो एक्टिव है और कितने हैं जिन्होंने सिर्फ लाइसेंस लेके उनके कबट में पड़ा है। ठीक है, वो ग्राउंड लेवल पे है ही नहीं। तो ये स्टेटिस्टिक्स भी हमको क्रॉस चेक करना चाहिए, ऐसा मुझे लगता है। तो थैंक यू।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल रिजवान, ये बात तो बिल्कुल सही है, क्योंकि मैं अभी पश्चिम बंगाल से आया हूँ। वहां पे जो हालत है वो इसकी उल्टी है। वहां पे करीबन हम लोग पूर्व मेदिनीपुर डिस्ट्रिक्ट में 7-8 जगह पे गए। वहां देवाशीष दा आएंगे, आप शाम को उनसे बात करना या कल परसों बात करना। ऐसे टूरिस्ट साइट्स इतने हो गए हैं और मछुआरों के लिए वहां पे जगह ही नहीं है। तो हम जब जाके उन मछुआरों से मिलते हैं कि आपका रजिस्ट्रेशन कहाँ है, आपका ID कार्ड कहाँ है, ताकि हम कुछ हक ले सकें, तो वो है ही नहीं कहीं आंकड़े में। तो जैसे आप कह रहे हैं उसका उल्टा हिस्सा भी है कि कहीं लाइसेंस है और बोट नहीं है, बहुत जगह बोट है और उसका लाइसेंस नहीं है। तो ये दोनों क्रॉस चेकिंग करना है। इसलिए जो गवर्नमेंट का जो सरकार का आंकड़ा है CMFRI में, वो हकीकत से बहुत कम है। जितने मछुआरे लोग कहते हैं उससे कहीं ज्यादा है। नेशनल फिशरीज पॉलिसी का जो जनवरी फरवरी में ड्राफ्ट आया है उसमें भी बहुत कम है। तो ऐसे बहुत सारे लोग हैं जो अभी तक फिशरी सेंसस में आए ही नहीं है, और वो स्कीम्स का एक तो कोई फायदा नहीं ले सकते, और दूसरा है कि वो सरकार जिसको गिनता है, बाकी जिसको नहीं गिनना चाहता है नहीं गिनता है, जो जोन्स अभी कह रहे थे। तो हाँ, ये बात तो है। शुक्रिया। और सविता,
Savita,
यू वांट टू?
yeah, Savita wanted to add something. Savita?
Yeah. No, yes, I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is to say, the intention also for us to keep this session on how we read fisheries in India today was essentially also to bring back what Siddharth's point was right at the start. If there is a bureaucrat sitting in Delhi, how is he or she looking at fisheries from their point of view? And like Jones rightly said, there is a dissonance or there's a disconnect between the way that fisheries scientists or bureaucrats read it through very clinically through say traditional, motorized, mechanized. In this whole picture that we see, we hardly talk about people and the narratives and their sort of experience, because it's all so technocratically driven. And I think the intention is also to expose that and sort of understand how the language also is very, very technical, right? Although, we may have gone very fast, it's not to really fixate on what those things specifically mean. And I think when you all go tomorrow or day after, when you all have the field visit and see the boats, then I think a lot of that clarity will come. But it is also to say that it all gets drowned in this very technical language, which is sort of very far away from often the experience of people. So that was one point. So when you also read papers or sit in these sessions, do be cognizant of the fact that it is that language that we are also trying to simultaneously expose, so that you see those differences in the way people in the way public policy is written versus actually, when there's actual conflict that happens, how that takes place. So that was one point. The second point that I wanted to make, because it came up even in the first session about overfishing, right? This claim of overfishing and what that actually means. We very often use that term so loosely, and it is said in a way where it really looks as if the blame is placed on the fish worker. But I think there are resources that Siddharth and I can also send to really, which talks about, where the onus of that, this idea of overfishing should perhaps be. Should it be where the demand for this fish is coming from? Is it at what point do you say a stock or a fishery has been overfished? Is it a longer historical sort of process that has led up to, creating capacity up to this point, where there is no other sort of trajectory that a fishery can take but to be overfished? And is it something that you can say that an entire fishery is overfished? Because like we saw in the morning, different fish have different lifespans, different places where they are in, different seasons when they occur. So how does one say that, use the blanket term overfished for an entire fishery, which is so diverse? So I guess these are some of the debates we'd like for everyone to engage in, but also to like tease apart, so that there is some discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Savita, and Jones too, for those interventions. I think it really helps, because some of these concepts are, this whole effort at synchronizing conceptual frameworks itself is a lot of fun to watch, but it's miserable for the people. So hence it is almost criminal to see the state trying to uniformize some of these concepts. But also, thanks, Avi, for bringing on the point about overfishing again. John, I think, from the whole discrepancy of having thought about a 12 nautical mile as your traditional artisanal craft scope, the unscientific nature of Indian or the statist approach to fisheries management starts right from there. Because it's never about the kilometers from the coast. It is about the depth of the sea, right? So, and that depth of the sea question is completely taken out because now you have decided the 12 nautical miles, and this is not now. We're talking about 30 years now. I mean, and this 12 nautical miles thing is imprinted in everybody's brain. Like the Coast Guard knows it, the Navy knows it. Everybody looks at a fisher person who is in the sea from this 12 nautical mile point of view. That's what the law says. So, so it's become like not just ironic, but it's also become cruel beyond a point. Now, the other side of this is also the fact that, I mean, some of us have been involved in this whole conflict between India and Pakistan, like the same way there is a conflict between India and Bangladesh to a much lesser degree, but with India and Sri Lanka to a greater degree in terms of the militarization of the conflict. Every year, India arrests on an average, I mean, Pakistan arrests on an average 1,000 Indian fish workers. Did you know this? So there are 1,000 Indian fish workers who are arrested on an average every year by the Pakistani Marine Security Agency. Now, the MSA arrests them basically because they trespass into the Pakistani sea. Now, I personally, of course, one started working on this issue from 2001 or 2002 when I was, just absolutely new in other media and I was handling the Pak India Forum Secretariat. There was this elderly leader from Gujarat, Premjibai Khokri. He used to tear us apart. Every second day he would be faxing us. There was no email, etc. He used to fax us the list of people who got arrested. We just didn't know what to do with it. Of course, over a period of time, you developed MHA, MEA, Pakistan High Commission. You developed relationships across the border in Pakistan through the Pak India Forum, etc. Groups started working on this issue because we realized that there are at least hundreds of Pakistani fishermen who are arrested by India and then thousands of Indian fishermen who are arrested by Pakistan. Then we actually came to the realization that Gujarat is the high point we are talking about, right, Rizwan? So Gujarat is the high point. Gujarat is the focal point also because Gujarat is actually a very interesting coastal area. Veravel is India's largest marine, fish export zone, and Veravel is a classic case study if you want to look at overfishing, for instance, right? So all our sympathies about the community has to be, a lot of people have told me this in the past, saying that keep aside these conversations about overshipping. Look at Veravel, what they have done. And these are marine conservation ecologists who have said this. On the other hand, when we met Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2009 or 10, I think, his first question to the fish workers on the issue of Indian fishermen getting arrested in Pakistan was that, "Aap log wahan jate kyun hai? Why do you go across this thing?" Because as a Prime Minister, his briefing entirely comes from a bureaucracy who says that these fishermen are lalchi. They're greedy for more fish. They are already overfished Gujarat Sea and hence they go over into Pakistan for fishing. Now, why do this Pakistani... So the truth is, the Gujarat coast, Gujarat Sea does not have much fish left and the Pakistani Sea has definitely lot more fish in the sea. Now, India-Pakistan difference in the sea itself is less than 75 years old that we all know. And these are hundreds and thousands of years of fishing that one is talking about. So let's keep that aside as well. Let us accept the sovereignty of both nations and let's talk about their own respective seas. But why is it that Gujarat has actually lost such high levels of depletion has happened in Gujarat? Why? Now, are the fish workers the only agency for this loss? In heavy industrialized fishing is not new in Gujarat. Yes, it has happened for the last 30 years. One has warned about it. Fish workers themselves have warned against it. As Jones correctly put it, there is a large number of fish workers, traditional craftspeople who are still out there fighting this industrialization on a daily basis, but who are faced with a Gujarat government which says, trawler boats are here to stay, and we will keep giving it to anyone who applies from the community for more trawler boats. Now, that was the case for 3 decades. So, of course, there is a question of highest number of trawler boats, as you saw in the statistics that Siddharth was putting out. You are running into like Of course, he spoke about 2,69,000 overall for India, but that's probably above 420 number of boats that we have, lakh number of boats that we are probably realistically looking at. And a largest contingent of it, of course, comes from Gujarat. But on the other hand, Gujarat Sea was also the classic example of how you could completely contaminate, kill, deplete with absolute impunity. The entire Gujarat model that you hear about in political science today is built on this depletion and on this contamination of the sea. And that nobody talks about. So in Gujarat, like the last 25 years of Gujarat's economy, if you look at it, the contribution of this particular factor of the industrialized fishing is substantial. But on the other hand, you also see that the coastal belt, like what now Modi ji has said about the rest of India, he has said that let us shift everything from Central Eastern states. All industrialization should shift to our vacant coastlands. We have 8,000 kilometers of vacant coastlands. This is quote unquote Somnath Temple, his speech in August 2015. Now, this is exactly what they did in 25 years in Gujarat. And the result of that was, I mean, when we found out, there's a comrade Ishita who did a study on this, which is the book that you must have come across. I don't know if it's part of the kit that you guys got. Where have the fish gone? That's a study that has been done. It is on how systematically this whole depletion and contamination, which led to the kill, happened in the Gujarat Sea. Now, you see from 1990 onward, I can show you paper cuttings after paper cuttings and memorandums after memorandums from Porbandar Boat Owners Association, the Mangrove Fish Workers Union, the National Fish Workers Forum. All sorts of fisher people's groups have been writing to the government saying that pollution, contamination, tourism projects, chemical projects on the coast, thermal power plants. Last being the Machimar Adhikar Sangharsh Samiti of Gujarat fighting the biggest and the dirtiest of the two thermal power plants, the Tata Mudra and the Adani Mudra project, and OPG as well. But all of them are given a green signal. All of them are allowed to flourish. They pump out, they rise the sea level temperatures by more than 7 degrees Celsius, and in the coastline, and you still expect the fish workers to get fish from that sea. So the other side of overfishing is also the story of the industrialization and the glamorized Gujarat model as well, when one is taking a case study into looking at resources and the exploitation of that in a state-funded, state-sponsored way. Siddharth, let me just come back to you for about 3-4 minutes before do we need a quick break? Because this conversation has a second part to it, which is to look at it from the community, people's perspective. We are looking at it from the state's perspective now. I think it's very important, and this picture will be incomplete if we don't speak about the second half of it. And I would want Siddharth and Savita both to step in there, but Siddharth to speak and present on that. Does somebody have a question at this point of time? Okay. It's Ishita, but it's a research collective publication. Ishita Sharma. It's part of the kit you got. Yeah, it's here, just given to. Yeah. So, Meghna and I didn't get your name. Anand first, and then Meghna.
Okay. So on January 25th. Okay. So on January 25th, there was an article in Hindu, the editorial section. It talks about the fishermen of Tamil Nadu and the conflict with Sri Lanka state. So in the article, it says that Tamil Nadu fishermen, Tamil Nadu fishermen exploit the remaining fishery resources on the Sri Lanka water side by side by replacing their trawlers with deep sea fishing. So is the population of the fish actually decreasing in the coast of Tamil Nadu, or is it something else on a matter of diplomatic matter?
We'll take that question and park it. Meghna wanted to add.
Yeah, so I wanted to check with, usually when independent researchers or somebody who's not related to a government agency or not coming from an NGO, when we enter into a government, a fisheries department or state fisheries office, when you want to get data from there, it's so difficult. It takes years, months, and you never get it. So why is this data even collected if it is in such a form? And even if it is collected, okay, if not given to us, at least collect it in the right way. Or how could we make it better in the future? Because this is very important. There is so much of effort that is being put into just collect the data. And when it is not being used, how is it going to be made sense of it?
இல்ல அவங்க சொன்னாங்க, அவங்க ஆனந்த் பதிவு பண்ணது என்னன்னா, ராமேஸ்வரத்துல உள்ள மீனவர்கள் வந்து இலங்கை எல்லை தாண்டது வந்து மீன்வளம் இல்லாம போறாங்க, அங்க மீன்வளம் இருக்கிறதுனால போறாங்க அப்படிங்கிற மாதிரி அவங்க அந்த கட்டுரையில பதிவு பண்ணாங்க. ஆனா குஜராத்ல இப்ப எனக்கு அண்ணன் பதிவு பண்ண, குஜராத்ல இருக்கிற சூழலும் ராமேஸ்வரத்துல இருக்கிற சூழலும் வேற. குஜராத்ல இருக்கிறது முழுக்க இண்டஸ்ட்ரியல் ஏரியாவா இருக்கு, அங்க மீன்வளம் இல்லாதனால அவங்க காலங்காலமா போன இடத்துக்கோ போயிட்டு இருக்காங்க. ஆனா நாங்க இன்னைக்கு 1940க்கு அப்புறம் இல்ல 46 விடுதலைக்கு அப்புறம் எல்லை பிரிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கு. ஆனா நாங்க காலங்காலமா அந்த நிலப்பரப்பு, இங்க சோழர்கள் ஆண்ட நிலப்பரப்பு, அங்க காலங்காலமா இங்க உள்ள இது இருக்குது. இங்க மன்னார் வளைகுடால உள்ள அந்த தொழில் அங்கதான் போய் அங்க பருவட்டுக்கு மீன் பிடிக்கிறதுக்கு காலங்காலமா பண்ணிக்கிட்டு இருக்கோம். அது இன்னைக்கு நேரத்து உள்ள சிக்கல் அல்ல. மீன்வளம் இல்லாம நம்ம அங்க போய் மீன் பிடிக்க போல. நம்மளோட எல்லை அது, நம்ம காலங்காலமா பயன்படுத்தின நிலப்பரப்புல நம்ம இன்னைக்கும் பயன்படுத்துறோம். ஆனா இன்னைக்கு வந்து இனவாத அரசுகள் அதை வேற விதமா கையாளும்.
So, Vijayan, I will சொன்னதா?
Okay, so the question was about not a question, a comment was that he was saying that in the Rameshwaram belt the reality is that it's not now that people have started making the effort to fish in the Sri Lankan Sea, etc. This whole context has to be understood differently. These are fish workers on both sides who have fished into each other's areas in an absolute non-conflict manner. They were never issues of nation state. So he was saying that unlike in the Gujarat state where the Gujarati fisher people are pushed out because of depletion of Gujarat Sea, this is a historical and continued activity. So it's not that in Rameshwaram people are now, because of a sudden depletion in the sea, they are being pushed out, right? Yeah. Translating correctly, right? Tamil is not my mother tongue, so it's difficult. Yeah.
The two governments put the boundaries suddenly in the middle. Even now, suddenly in the middle. Even now, church. Yeah.
You're not supposed to go into Sri Lankan, and then Sri Lankan police, like those, they just started beating them, and they're like, you're not supposed to come in our region. But those fishermen are actually, they from many years they are doing their fishing in that area, and they know that area more than other this. So they are like used to go there, and now they are like, they are stopped, and their whole thing is like on, they are best on that thing. So now it is like
church festivals are common. They jointly conduct. Church festivals they jointly conduct. So historically,
yeah, I mean just a yeah.
Sorry. Say both are what they were saying. Sri Lankan border, fishermen, Tamil Nadu fishermen crossing border should be seen from a different lens, not from the lens of the government, saying that there is no resources and whatever they register, whatever Kevi and Sridhar said also the same. There is a fishing done in the early history. When does this problem happen? The root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem happened only after the colonial rule, when there was a conflict rise. So there was a conflict rights, and they claimed that this is our boundary. They didn't claim there is a boundary. They said that conflict raised between Tamils and fishers. That is the other story, ethnic conflict. Coming to the fishing, yeah, in 70s, still that whatever they said, it is about a maritime trade they had. They had a traditional catamarans playing with cotton nets, doing fishing there, no issues. There was Kachati was an island middle. Both were doing fishing. There was a religious cult to it. This is sacred ecology. Very good. Government, 1915 after freedom, FIO came with the expert of bringing trawlers into India. FIO is food and agriculture. Who are the stalwarts of bringing all fishing gears as well as all the hybrid seeds in the farming land. They are the UN body, development knowledge partner. So they said very clearly that they scoped out various, they scoped out various sources of bringing trawlers in. That time there was a pink revolution. That is a hunch on dollar rate was for prawns. So pink revolution. That is called pink revolution in 70s. So what happened is that they located certain pockets of bringing trawlers in. In Tamil Nadu, 3 locations they spotted. One is Thoothukudi, other one is Rameshwaram, other one is Chennai. Okay. So you are going to give a boat. Which have 80 horsepower engine. You are going to give them the boat. So right. You are going to give them boat. There was a GO in 1918 saying that the government order in the 1980 government order, Tamil Nadu government order says that motorized boats cannot play after the ethnic conflict started in 1960. There is no permission for onboard engine motor boats. That means motorized boats cannot be used in Rameshwaram because Rameshwaram to Talaimannar, Sri Lankan, it is just 22 kilometers. It's just 22 kilometers. Motorized boat is what horsepower is 5 horsepower. So we can go speed there and we should come speed here. Na? With the one go, we'll go there. So motorized boats are completely banned. There is a GO because fishermen will cross the border. One thing. Then the uniform way of scheme. Trawler came. Give everybody trawler. Go to Rameshwaram, give them trawler. What will happen to a trawler? Trawler is 120 horsepower. You press the trawler itself, he will be in Talaimannar. And he has an active gear, trawl gear, which they didn't have in that. Active gear goes to fish coming to them. And these are all river bed. These are all coral bed. Trawl have 2 boats, which will make the trawl to sit in the bed. It will spoil everything. So this is the lacuna of the policy. Then this is one side of the fishing crisis came. So obviously this is not done by fishers. It is extremely done. Then Kerala also, everybody comes there. The other these foreign experts, not only the fisheries experts, there are foreign experts, foreign ambassadors and experts in foreign relations. They come with certain GOs. So when the unclosed border was being dividing, there was Bandaranaike. Bandaranaike was Srimava was talking with our Indira Gandhi, saying that we need that Kachativu back. Give us Kachativu, we will give you Triguna surveillance. Taking Kachativu means she asked in a very correct manner because she knows law of peace. She has graduated in laws of peace. And that unclassed president was also from a Sri Lankan. He said very clearly that claim Kachativu back to us, so that if you claim Kachativu back, another 7 nautical will come to you. Boundary. So just 5 nauticals will be Indian water.
Thanks. I mean, on that point, just to pick off from where I was going to continue with. I'm not going to give a community perspective because I think there are people from the community and your relationship with them over the next few days is going to add a lot of that perspective. Talking about Vijayan's point, and that statement is given by President Nixon to his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, when the UNCLOS negotiations were on. And I think that is essentially what is important, is that the UNCLOS was not really about fish, and it was never about small-scale fishers or traditional fishers. There was a retrofitting into resources and access that happened because of the UNCLOS. And it's important that we look at the UNCLOS as being a historical phenomena of dividing the oceans into state sovereignty, where it gives you the illusion of development and freedom. But on the same time, because the state represents a particular kind of idea, a particular kind of science, a particular kind of bureaucracy, which in India at least is largely upper caste, is largely male, you end up with the problems that we've been speaking about. So for example, India's EEZ is part of 150 EEZs, and India's got 6 borders. So you've got Pakistan, you've got Maldives, you've got Sri Lanka, you've got Bangladesh, and then Andaman and Nicobar share borders with Myanmar and Indonesia. And so fish resources constantly swim between borders. It's a very dynamic ecosystem. And the idea of rigid borders kind of negate histories. And so it was never about the fish. And it's important that we problematize the simple notion that this is Indian waters. The other problem related to this, which is a big part of Indian fisheries today, is that when an Indian fishing flag goes out into the oceans, it carries a part of India with it. And so if I end up with an Indian fishing vessel off the coast of East Africa, there's a bit of India in the east coast of Africa. And that geopolitical kind of implication of fisheries actually ends up lending fisheries policies an importance that is far more than the economic gains or the GDP calculations that come from fisheries. So when we look at GDP, 1% of India's GDP is fisheries, or like 6% is from fishery, of the agri GDP is fisheries, it's very important to look at what's happening as well. And so if you look at current budgets talking about fisheries expansion, deep sea expansion, it's also important to look at where is China in the Indian Ocean. What are American-Indian conversations about fisheries that are happening? These are tied in with fisheries and EEZs, which the state represents particular interests. And it's important that we kind of problematize that. So that's one point. The second point, of course, is that it's not just internationally that this plays out, right? So I was listening to the Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, kind of northern Sri Lanka fishers conflict. And some of us were part of this tribunal that just concluded. And in fact, northern Sri Lanka and southern Sri Lanka also have a conflict that is very kind of based along ethnic lines, religious lines about what the state does in the north, vis-a-vis what it does in the south. There are European interests with Chinese ports, with Adani kind of investing tied up with fisheries on my last point. And similarly, you have intersectoral conflicts that happen within regional state boundaries. And I at least would, I'd love to have a discussion about this if we have the time, but I definitely feel very strongly about moving away from the binary of the state versus the people. I think there's a lot more of fluidity in conflicts that appear between sectors, within different class, caste, genders of the country that we need to be talking about. And I'll end with that because you all are going for 2 field visits, and I'd like you to kind of make your own observations about some of these things in Goa. The third thing, of course, is that fisheries science, and I'm going to, this is not to offend anyone. I used to work in conservation for 6 years, and I was to think like the technocrat. So I think we very often in the private English educated kind of infrastructure in society that a lot of us grow up in, this becomes common sense that this is the way of counting fish. This is the way of development. This is what a fisher looks like. And fishery science is very much tied up in this technical, economic rationale of fisheries. And the reason this is interesting is that, over the last 20 years at least, the maximum potential yield of Indian fisheries has kept on increasing. So if you look at the bottom, it was 4.4 million tons. Suddenly it's 5.3 million tons because new science has proved that there's more fish and more unexplored potential. And a lot of this fish, as Jones was talking about earlier, is completely devoid of social science, is completely devoid of people. There's econometric, rational choice theory, demand and supply, quotas, counting fish, allocating property rights, and ensuring that that brings in sustainability. It plays out again and again in World Bank documents. It plays out in blue economy related documents. It plays out even in the latest national fisheries policy of the country. And so fishery science is possibly one of the most uncertain sciences that we have, just because it is a transboundary, fluid, dynamic ecosystem that is also reeling under the climate crisis. And so the traditional way of using maximum sustainable yield calculations, etc., which were anyway flawed and didn't have people and measurements within them, are further off. And therefore, when we talk about overcapacity and overfishing, we also have to think about what is the science that is proving this. Because more importantly, not only are we talking about overfishing today, the Indian state and a lot of other states are actively moving towards criminalization of overfishing. And we know that when there's criminalization that comes in and moves away from civil penalties of, let's say, the fisheries department to a court or the police investigating fisheries crimes, it's the vulnerable and at the margins that end up bearing the brunt of criminalization. And so coastal police, the Indian Coast Guard, will go after the smallest boats because it's easier to look at violations there than some of the larger interests that are also fishing out at sea. That's the other thing to keep in mind. We've gone into this. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so this was the fishing gear. And just to talk about Jones's point, I mean, I saw this, and I'll send this slide, but you can look at it, right? Like, this is the kind of documenting that all of this workshop could play a really important role in doing, which is that, you know, this is a post with like 10 photographs, and it's got 10 different kind of boats that are nowhere in their nomenclature or in their use really represented in mainstream policy. And I think it's important that we start doing that as well, because simply looking at fisheries from the state's perspective does very little to understand what's actually happening. So the last 3 slides, I think, or 4 slides. So this is interesting, right? Like, it starts with the unit. If you look at the 5th column, it starts with fishermen. And it's very interesting that a lot of the policy has been in the domain of the man as the unit of fishing, and fishing, which is in the male domain, as being the policy center of the fishing sector. What happens before and after the act of fishing is very often very neglected. It's missing in data, particularly as we have it today. Women fish workers or women fishers are missing, and also migrant fish workers are entirely missing. And that loses a lot of who is the policy addressing. It's very easy to reduce the kind of community down to being a group of people who are poor, in need of upliftment, which for 70 years has, you know, kept that narrative going. And so again, who are we representing? Who are we working with? What is the community there? What are the women there? What are the migrant workers there? Where do they place themselves in larger society? I think some of these questions, again, depending on the local specificity of the caste dynamics, about the political economy of the state in itself. So, for example, Kolis in Mumbai, as being the Shiv Sena's vanguard of the Marathi Manus and Sons of the Soil, is very different to an Odia fisher in Chilka, or a Jele fisher in West Bengal, who's classified as scheduled caste, was neglected by the left in land redistribution, so very much relies on the coastal commons as the primary means of access. And so I think the state also negates some of these specificities, which are very regional, and we need to get into that a little bit as well. About women, so the latest national fisheries policy, which one would imagine that the experts drafting this had the best available data that, as Meghna said, isn't available to a lot of us. And yet, of a number of fishers, which is at 37 lakh, they count 14,000 women as engaged in fish seed collection. And we definitely know that that is highly inaccurate. Similarly, you don't really have who are the women who are working in fish mending, fish drying, fish smoking, what is kind of their role between families and workplaces. And just to echo Magdalene Chechi, who in Occupation of the First had done a brilliant interview. If you all have the book, I would really kind of encourage you to read that piece. She said that 70 years of fisheries policies have meant that, you know, men have gone from having non-motorized boats to mechanized boats. And women have gone from having a kind of bamboo or a cane basket to an aluminum basket. And I think that in its very simplicity captures the policy or the gendered nature of fisheries policy. And I think Nalini Nayak will be coming, and from a feminist point of view, from a gendered lens, I think that would be a very, very enriching session. We know comrades and friends from the community very often talk about this absence in policy. It's not even looked upon as them as being workers or active members. It's always that they are the added unit of the fisherman, and there's a big need to question that as well. And then finally, something that came out very largely during the COVID-19 crisis is just like the migration in the country was reflected in migration in the fishing sector. And Dakshin had put together a network of people which created this graphic on the left, which just briefly, I think about 1,500 people only mapped, where are the different routes. We found people working in Ratnagiri from Nepal. There were people working in Gujarat from Dibrugarh, from the northeast. Srikakulam had 25,000 fishers working in Veeraval. Goa had fishers from central India, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, and Jharkhand, who were working on the boats. And these are people we've never even considered as being fishers. You look at fishers as being the imagery of a small boat, a husband and wife, or the man alone, casting a boat or a net. And that's the idea of the fisher. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And for the last 16 years, at least, we don't have a census that actually counts the number of migrants in the sector. So the image on the right, for example, in Goa, shows that of the 16,000, so primary is people who work on the boat, and then secondary is in fish markets and ice plants and vending and things like that. So of the 16,000 fishers who worked in Goa in 2005, only 2,500 came from the fishing villages, which means that even then there was a huge number of people who were migrants. And it changes state to state as well. So for example, if you look at Kerala, where there's been a strong workers movement, in 2005, the difference of migrants, there was 140,000 from the villages, and there was 194,000 total. So the difference wasn't the same. But Maharashtra, Karnataka, Goa, these are states that show an immense amount of migration. But whether you look at periodic labor force surveys, whether you look at NCEUS data, whether you look at marine fisheries census in itself, like the 2010 census, which is the last one that we've had, didn't carry any data on migration. The 2015 census data has not yet been released. The 2020 census, if it's ongoing, it's not progressed too far. So we are way behind on data, and people just fall through the cracks. We've lost people to injuries. We've lost people to panic attacks and deaths during the pandemic. We've lost people on the roadside after leaving the ship, no way to go back home. We've dealt with postmortems and police picking up bodies. Like all of that has happened in Goa in itself. I was there for 3 months when the lockdown was announced, and it was really horrific. I mean, I wouldn't say it's interesting or eye-opening, but it was horrific to see that there was this large invisible workforce. So that's something that really contributes to the fishing sector as well. And the reason I said is, Andhra acts as a huge state, a state which has a lot of migrants. There are Andhra people in Pakistan jail. There are Andhra people in Bangladesh prisons, or they've been fired upon by the Bangladesh port. Again, borders, whose resource is it, who actually fishes, what criminalization of oceans does, and who gets impacted the most. I mean, there's a pattern to it that we really need to be kind of discerning about. And similarly, what's happening in that coastline that is causing people to migrate. So we know Andhra produces 80% of India's export shrimp. The Krishna and Godavari basins are completely taken over by intensive shrimp farms. Srikakulam is a huge cyclone kind of receiving center. There's been a lot of displacement that has been happening there. People migrate for work, but then they're absent in that migration. So I think it's important to look at what's happening in places where people are migrating from as well. With Adivasis and people from the scheduled tribes, obviously coal, conservation, extraction within central India's plateaus, a certain kind of casteist approach towards agriculture and development there play into why people migrate, how they get treated in Goa when they arrive. And that in itself is a huge part of the structure. The relationship between traditional and small-scale fishers, fisher women, and migrant fish workers is a complicated one. I know that Shashikala Tai, who is the head of the Women Vendors Union in Goa, is very for mechanized fishing because Goa's mechanized fisheries land sardines and anchovies and bombil, which get exported to other states. And other states' fish that come in via traders and mechanized boats actually end up feeding Goans cheaper fish than the Ramponkars can through motorized boats and show scenes. But the migrant workers are in conflict with the traditional fishers. And so there's a whole nexus of tension that is playing out in the fisheries sector, which has got nothing to do with the state, but definitely lends legitimacy to a lot of what we looked at in the first presentation. And it's important to look at that. And finally, the last point, I think, is that nature in itself or ecology in itself is a very absent component of fisheries policymaking. And I just want to point out 4 things like the continental shelf and the bottom of the ocean in itself. Riverine areas, estuarine areas, what happens to them and how they feed into coastal ecosystems. Currents, monsoon seasons, weather patterns, and what that means for fish species, distribution, and fishers. Jones spoke about diversification of fishing gears. We've seen an increasing number of cyclones happening in the region. That all plays into what happens with fisheries. And then finally, you've got the coast in itself, which is very, very dynamic. And as that bottom half kind of shows, that in the development vision, it might be 8,100 kilometers of emptiness, but essentially it's a very, very active space that is alive in itself, even without humans. But then we have traditional fishers and fishing community who have been dynamic with these ecosystems. And that's where the importance really becomes important to challenge how the state thinks about some of these things. I'm probably not going to go into this. I don't think it's needed, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. One is, of course, if you look at, I'll send you these booklets, but if you look at the top left figure of Goa, you've got the main species, then you've got the breakdown between sectors, and then you've got the main seasons. And that kind of hints towards the kind of dynamic nature of fisheries in itself. Then if you look at the gear breakup, 87% comes from purse seines. Now, purse seine gears in itself target mesopelagic stocks, which are naturally fluctuating between booms and busts. They're also very labor intensive. So some of the large purse seine boats can require up to 41 workers. But the fisheries in themselves are not much more profitable than, let's say, the older gears were. And so there's been a pressure on cost reduction, also from a natural perspective of fisheries cycle, but also from cost effectiveness, and enter displaced Adivasis from central India. Andhra workers who used to work in Goa look at this kind of labor-intensive work as being beneath their skill level and have moved to Karnataka and Gujarat, which have, really become dynamic spaces for multi-day trawls or like landing ribbon fish for exports to China, etc., for the fish meal industry. And so there is this constant flux that is happening all the time as well. And when one goes to the harbor, it's very important to be cognizant about some of these relationships. And that's essentially why I put this up, but in interest of time, I won't do Gujarat. And finally, I think I'll end here, and maybe Vijayan can pick it up and some of the other people as well, is that I think I've deliberately made this kind of background black with red text, because black is resistance, and I think red is that a lot of what we have in this country is actually being paid in blood by the fishers of this country. And, every Marine Fishing Regulation Act, every Coastal Regulation Act, every, shrimp regulation, banning of, like anything positive that you think has happened has come through resistance in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And, we are at a point where that resistance is under threat, which is why I think that's the main part about this workshop as well, is how do we go back and remember this history so that we can play a part in rebuilding that resistance by, looking at some of these complexities of society, of state, and our own space within them. So I'm just going to end there and let Vijayan take over. Maybe there's scope for discussion from these points as well.